listening to the Hunter Conservationist Podcast.
All right, we're all recording. So this episode might give folks the heebie-jeebies. So I think that's probably, like, obviously there's a title to the show now that you're listening to it, but I'm recording and setting this up, I'm thinking, well, what am I going to call this episode? Sometimes it comes to me after the show, just like a book, right? You don't start out necessarily with the title in mind. But anyways, I've kind of landed on this heebie-jeebies thing because I think this topic is going to give folks the heebie-jeebies. But it's a topic that fascinates me because as an ecologist, I am fascinated with everything to do with ecosystems, learning all the plants and the mosses and insects and, not just the big charismatic animals, but all the tiny stuff, the nuanced stuff. I'm fascinated with the relationships between different things in ecosystems, evolutionary history, niche species, cycles, that are happening in ecosystems, oscillations, that happen over different time scales, rise and fall patterns, things in ecosystems, start out, they build up, they accelerate, and then they collapse. Those types of things at a big scale fascinates me. But we hear a lot about, bears and wolves, being like the architects of ecosystems and the keystone species and these apex predators. But, for me, I tended to always look at the small things in ecosystems and their influence on everything in the ecosystem, sometimes the invisible things, soil microbes, things like erosion, decomposition, diseases, soil fungi, all of these things that are major drivers of ecosystems, but just never get the spotlight, never get, the front page leading story that they should deserve. And so that's why I'm really excited about this episode, because I think we're going to dive into the world of parasites and help broaden my understanding and maybe hopefully your understanding as well, listeners, on the role of parasites in shaping ecosystems and shaping evolution, having an influence in predator-prey dynamics, which a lot of people are very interested in. And maybe we can dive into these questions about keystone species and apex predators in the current narratives about what these keystone and apex predator species really are. So it's going to be a fun EBGB episode. I think the only thing that would have been maybe better for this show would have been like the Halloween episode or something like that. So anyways, maybe we'll do something on bats around Halloween or whatever. But anyways, looking forward to this. Hey everybody, it's Mark Hall, your host.
And it's Curtis Hall, your co-host. The Hunter Conservationist Podcast is proudly brought to you by J. Martin Taxidermy, a family-run business driven by passion, tradition, and a deep respect for the outdoors. Founded by avid conservationist Jesse Martin in West Kelowna, British Columbia, alongside his wife Casey and their two boys, J. Martin Taxidermy brings generation of hunting heritage and artistry to life. Born and raised in the Okanagan, Jesse grew up surrounded by the wild, inspired by a home filled with taxidermy that felt more like a museum. What began as a hobby quickly grew into a lifelong calling, fueled by formal studies in wildlife and forestry conservation, and refined through professional training at the Penn School of Taxidermy. With a commitment to excellence, Jesse continues to hone his craft through national conventions and seminars, ensuring that every mount tells a story and preserves a memory. As always, big shout out, big thank you to Jesse at J. Martin Taxidermy for supporting us and what we do here on this show. So thank you, Jesse.
So this taxidermy fact is kind of a little bit of taxidermy and Canadiana history. So Charles Waterton was from England, 1800s. He was a naturalist and an explorer. Some say he was a master taxidermist. Others say he was a skilled taxidermist. Others said he wasn't a taxidermist at all. but he developed his own method for preserving skins, called the mercuric chloride method. Those would be the chemicals that were used. But he was very well known for being eccentric. So one of the things he did is when he had guests, he would pretend he was a dog and he would go under the dinner table and bite people's legs. And then he used his taxidermy to like scare people and taunt people. But this is a famous thing about him is after his naturalist expedition trip to Guyana in 1824, he claimed to have hunted a new species that resembled a man. So experts now believe that his nondescript, which means that he hunted and killed something that's a species that didn't fit into any known category, was actually a fabricated creature. The hindquarters and the legs, experts said they think was molded from a howler monkey. Charles Waterton only ever spent a few days in Canada in 1824. He visited Quebec City, Montreal, and Niagara Falls. And after that, and all of his eccentricities and whatnot, the Canadian government decided to name Waterton Lake and Waterton National Park after him. So that's a crazy story. Nothing to do with parasites, but just kind of a little fun thing there to kick us off. Dr. Michael Stock, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's awesome. Now, you are the author. Let me hold it up here. Folks listening aren't going to be able to see it. Fur, Fleas, and Flukes, The Fascinating World of Parasites. So I read the book this winter, and then I read your companion book, The Flying Circus, which is all about parasites in birds and evolution, and super fascinating how specific species are to how specific species of parasites are specific to certain species of animals, and we can use that for all kinds of things in evolution and movement of species around the world. But we'll zero in on fur, fleas, and flukes, and I'm just like I said, this is probably going to give folks Heebie-Jeebies, because you're thinking tapeworms and flukes and and trichinosis, and like this is the topic, folks. Fleas, these sorts of things. What inspired you to write this book? So you're a retired biological science professor from MacEwan University in Edmonton. Did you write this book before you retired, or is this something retired guys do? They write books about things. What brought a book about?
Well, I wrote the first book on bird parasites, basically, because of my love for birds. I just love birds and bird watching, and so that was the inspiration for that. And I thought, when you look at a bird, lots of us like to watch birds, and we're impressed by seeing birds and how beautiful they are. See blue jays at your feeders and whatever, and Stellar's jays where you guys are and stuff. And you say, that's just gorgeous, that's beautiful. But, we don't understand that living on the outside and living in the insides of these things, there's a zoological garden of other organisms. And they're all invisible to us, usually, unless you have to go looking for them. But they have all kinds of effects on the biology of these animals. They affect their behaviors. They affect their ecology. They affect their reproduction. They even affect their evolutionary history. So those are secret organisms that most of us don't have any understanding of. And so that was what inspired me to write the first book. I wanted to let people know who love birds like I do, that when you're seeing a bird, you're seeing a whole ecosystem there. And to me, that's fascinating. And so the second book, Fur, Fleas, and Flukes, just followed on naturally from that book, because I'd done some research projects on mammals as well.
Okay.
So they also have similar but different stories to tell too. So their ecology,
very fascinating,
their behavior, even their appearances. Like there's a chapter about zebra stripes in the book, Even the appearances of these animals are affected by the parasites that they have living on them and inside them as well. So that's what inspired me. I thought
and
a
around
lot of
them.
people
Yeah.
would like to know about these things that are creepy and crawly and going on
Yeah,
in
yeah,
animals.
absolutely. Especially for our listeners that are hunters, we always
Boy,
talk about clean, ethical, animal meat and stuff, and there's no hormones or no chemicals and stuff. And well, now it's the Heebie-Jeebie time. Other than like a few things, or you're either talking things that are on the outside or inside organs, nervous system, inside brains and stuff. There's of course trichinellas in the muscle tissue, which is what hunters are after as well. But yeah, it's always a concern. So I picked a number of themes and topics and chapters out of Fur Fleas and Flukes, and hopefully we can just kind of explore those and give folks a flavor of each one of these species and the relationships and with parasites. So I think wolves is like a hot topic. It has been for quite a few years in North America. It's becoming much more prevalent now with the whole news stories of wolves being translocated to Colorado. Wolves came out of northern British Columbia and stuff, and that was one of the first chapters. I was just riveted by this story because, I mean, to be honest, like I never heard about this relationship between wolves and worms and what they're actually doing to be able to bring down prey. So give folks a recap of what parasites are doing for wolves.
yeah. So inside wolves, there live tiny little parasitic tapeworms. By small, they're not much larger than a grain of rice, basically, a long grain rice. So that's how tiny they are. And inside an individual wolf, there can be several 100,000 of these worms living. And in the wolf, they have no effect on the wolves, as far as we can tell at all. They live quiet lives inside the intestines of those wolves, probably absorbing food from the intestine of the wolves. No effect at all. No pathological effects on the wolves. The wolves aren't sick. You couldn't tell a wolf that's infected with the parasites versus one that's not infected by looking at them at all. In fact, it turns out that the wolves that are the most successful hunters probably have the most worms inside them. And that led to an interesting question. Well, why would that be? And it turns out that the eggs that are produced by these tapeworms are passed with the feces of the wolves out into the environment. And then when any other sort of warm-blooded animal comes along, and usually it's things like voles or rodents or rabbits or squirrels, and they happen to ingest, and it can be just simply by inhaling the eggs, ingesting the eggs will then hatch inside those animals, and they will form larval stages that are like cancer. They proliferate, they spread. There's one species of the little tapeworms that produce single little cysts that are the size of golf balls or ping pong balls. Those are less dangerous than the other ones, and they produce cysts inside. These are called hydatid cysts that proliferate just like cancer, and they spread and they form locules like little bulges that keep coming off. And inside every one of those little bulges, there are thousands, millions of more tapeworm parasites. And what happens is they end up causing the animals that are infected with these hydatid cysts to get sick, to be more lethargic, to not have the stamina that a normal animal would have. And in fact, for animals the size of moose, for example, they will eventually cause them to become so sick that they can be easily killed by predators. And of course, the primary predator that the tapeworms are interested in are other wolves that are going to kill those animals And then wolves will ingest the digestive organs and the livers and the spleens and the lungs of their prey. And once they do that, they will then get infected with these tapeworms, which will develop into the adult tapeworms inside the wolves. Again, to wolves, it means nothing. They don't cause any pathology. They don't make them sick. In fact, for wolves, it's a good thing because it makes prey easier to kill, to get and to kill.
Yeah.
So to the tapeworms, this system is ideal if they can make their host, intermediate host, things like voles and squirrels and rabbits and deer and moose, sick, because it works to make them be passed on to the wolves, their final host. And so what that means is, if we think about the bigger scale, what that means is these tiny little tapeworms that nobody would ever see are actually affecting the predator-prey relationships that are happening in our boreal forests, and are, in fact, turning the tides to make it easier for wolves to capture their prey, and changing the balance between predators and prey. And that's what these tapeworms are doing. So now the sad news is, of course, or the bad news, I guess, or the dangerous news is that humans can also act as intermediate host for these tapeworms.
Oh, okay.
So if we happen to come across wolf scats, wolf feces, and we're not careful, and we ingest the eggs, which are microscopically small and can be inhaled and ingested, then those tapeworms can develop these hydatid cysts inside us. Often they're misdiagnosed by doctors as cancer. They think that they're dealing with a patient with cancer. And in fact, these are these hydatid cysts that can proliferate inside. They can be treated, they can be removed, and they can be treated, but nevertheless, it is a danger. So that's the case with these parasites.
Yeah. Wow. Um, so there's folks, hence the heebie-jeebies. Like, you just all of a sudden you're just envisioning, hunters that are like having some moose liver or moose heart or whatever, and it's like, well, there's your internal organs, right? Now, so the obvious question is, could you see these?
Well,
Could the cysts be visible, let's say, in a moose
yeah,
liver?
for hunters, they definitely are.
Okay.
So when you're processing your animal and you see large cysts in the lungs or the livers of these animals, uh, they're easy to see. They're easy to detect. But here's the good news: you are perfectly safe. You cannot get infected by eating those cysts. You could eat them raw. You could eat moose liver raw, and you can ingest the cysts, and you are not going to get infected or get sick. So the problem for us would be if we're dealing with the feces of canids,
Okay.
essentially
Okay.
bulls, coyotes. That's where the danger comes in.
Okay. No, I
So
get
a
it.
good
I get
friend
it.
of
Yeah.
a good friend of mine was doing volunteer work at an animal shelter in southern Alberta, and they were processing animals that were coming in. He was just, taking the animals in, weighing them, getting their records, and so on. And a few months after doing this volunteer work, he developed excruciating pain in his digestive system and his lungs. And he was lucky enough to go to a doctor that was treating people from South Africa. The doctor originated from South Africa. And he recognized what was happening right away and diagnosed this as hydatid disease, caused by the tapeworms. And lo and behold, my friend had to come to Edmonton to the university hospital and had 4 large cysts removed from his lungs and liver, which were the tapeworms, the parasitic tapeworms. So for hunters, we
Okay.
can go ahead and eat liver and heart and lungs, and be perfectly safe from this tapeworm. It's not going to cause us to get sick. The bad news would be if you decided that you're going to be kind to your dog and you're going to give your dog some heart or liver or lung tissue raw to eat, because then your pet, your dog, could become infected with these little tapeworms, and they're in the intestines of your pets. And of course, I don't know about your guys' dogs, mines will defecate in my backyard, for example, sometimes, and I have to clean it up. And there you go. You're exposed to the eggs of the tapeworms too now. So they become a risk for you.
Jeez, wow.
Of course, because coyotes are now urban animals, and they also are infected with the same type of tapeworm. It becomes a real dangerous problem in cities now that have lots of coyotes.
Yeah, yeah. Now, in the chapter on this one, on the wolves and the tapeworms, you kind of gave like this, I think it was like a scenario, like so people could just envision like a wolf pack. They're out hunting, they come across a couple of moose, and then they start to pursue and push these animals in the snow. And there was like, one of the moose had these cysts in its lungs because it picked it up at some time ago. And you talked about how those cysts grows and it affected like the volume capacity of the lungs. And so maybe just kind of walk us through how that makes the animal more susceptible.
Sure. So the cysts, as I mentioned, the cysts grow like cancer and keep giving off bulbs or cysts that keep displacing the normal tissue that's there. So essentially, it's just kind of like cancer, essentially, in the animal. And so in the book, I talk in that chapter about the cow moose and her yearling kind of being the cow being infected. It's more likely that older animals are going to be infected than younger animals. And what it'll do is replace the normal lung tissue, which therefore obviously affects the stamina, the ability for the animal to escape predators. So
Yeah,
also it's
just
interesting that there's some
the cardio
suggestion.
fitness of
Yeah,
the
cardio
animal.
fitness.
Okay, yeah.
There's some suggestion that even the breath of the moose that's infected is different and attractive to wolves too. So, but I don't know.
Oh,
There's not a lot of research about that, so it's just
okay.
speculation. So
It makes sense though, because you see all this stuff, how dogs, they're using them to like, they can detect cancer in people and they're sniffing like drugs and corpses and invasive, you know, invasive mussels on boats and stuff. So
yeah.
yeah, I would say that's a real possibility that they might be able to, even just by odor, you know, be able to go, that's the one.
That's one
And
to go after. Yeah,
isn't that just crazy? Like it's just
yeah,
to what everybody thinks about, the wolf moose ecosystem and in the north and stuff, and so much of that success is driven by the role of this parasite in that. Do they really know, like, are different, like, let's say different wolf packs, different wolf ecosystems, like some don't carry a lot, others are like high prevalence rates? Like, do
yeah,
we know anything about
yeah.
that?
The studies that were done are from this, like started in the 60s and 70s.
Ooh, okay.
And, biological research usually doesn't get funded over long terms for studies like that. So I would say that my guess would be, and this is just a guess, that you would find that some areas have a higher prevalence, the number of wolves that are infected, and a higher intensity, the number of worms that are in each wolf, sort of thing.
Okay.
That would
Okay.
vary in different areas, uh, uh, geographic areas as well, different packs. But again, there's been no real research money to support the kind of studies that would be necessary to see if that's the case or not. So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I did have somebody from Colorado who knew a little bit about this dynamic, was, expressing concerns about moving wolves out of northern BC into Colorado for this translocation project. And
yeah,
I'd go, well, you'd have to think that the veterinarians and everything that are involved in this, no, they would quarantine the animals. They probably got rounds of, stuff. They had to keep them for, 5 days or something like that before they moved him on. Cause he sort of was like, geez, and now they're going to be running around on the landscape, spreading these tapeworms into the elk population. And here we go. So there was somebody who was actually, quite knowledgeable about this relationship, which I found, fascinating. But I don't know for sure, but I would have to go, I'm pretty sure they probably are sterilizing, the animals, so to speak.
The good news about that is, I guess, it's really easy to detect in the fecal samples of the infected wolves.
Okay.
So you could diagnose it. You could tell if that wolf's infected or not infected.
Yeah.
Really fast.
Just anesthetize it and then take a stool sample. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Just collect from the ground. If you've got a sample from the ground, you can identify.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, super fascinating. So let's move on to the next one. So if you're a hunter, you probably know about trichinosis. So the cysts that can be in the tissue, the meat of bears and cats, and the whole thing of cooking it, properly to like 165 degrees or whatever, sustained, over a period of time, and then you're safe. I think most folks probably know, the whole story of Steven Rinella from Meat Eater, who ate some undercooked black bear meat, up in Alaska or whatever, and was kind of on death's bed in the hospital, kind of thing, as these parasites were working their way into his body and forming calcified cysts in his tissue in case he ever gets eaten. But your chapter was on the Arctic and Arctic ecosystems and mammals and changes that scientists are seeing in trichinosis up there. So Phyllis, there's not a whole lot of, it's not a complex ecosystem in the Arctic. It's kind of like, plankton, fish, seals, polar bear. Like that's kind of the extent of it. So what are scientists seeing in the Arctic?
Yeah, so we've known that trichinosis, trichinella, these little roundworms, have been in polar bears for a long time. And I think I start the chapter in the book by telling a story about the Second World War and how the German weather station,
Yeah, that's right. I remember that.
soldiers that were posted to the weather station killed a polar bear there and consumed the meat. And I guess they didn't cook it enough. And they all developed trichinosis and had to be evacuated. And the weather station was abandoned, which might have turned tide in the war with regards to being able to predict weather patterns. That's kind of interesting. But
Absolutely.
we know
Way to go, Parasite.
Parasite might have won us the war there.
Remember that on November 11th.
So we know that polar bears are infected. But how do they get infected? The way you get infected with trichinosis is by consuming meat, scavenging on a carcass and consuming the meat that have the little cysts, and then that's how it is acquired. And so, well, what are polar bears eating? Well, they're eating mainly marine things like seals. So how on earth do the worms get from polar bears into seals and then get back to the polar bears? Or are polar bears eating other polar bears, for example? That would be another method that it could be spread. So it's an interesting question. And it turns out that it looks like this particular kind of trichinosis, trichinella, has become adapted for surviving for periods of time in the ocean. So they're able to survive, maybe not develop, but to stay just active inside crustaceans like crabs or marine animals and into fish, and then eventually find their way into seals. And when they're in the seal flesh, then of course they get eaten by polar bears and they become infected. But it's quite an interesting mystery how it's transmitted in the Arctic. And research is still being done right now to try to figure that out. And there are some hints that suggest that if the Arctic becomes warmer, which it appears to be getting because of global warming issues, that's going to increase this transmission of trichinella through that marine ecosystem and into bears, and of course into anything else that's eating seals and walruses. Apparently it's in walruses too, and there have been cases of human trichinosis in people who've eaten fermented or raw walrus meat, for example, in the far north. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. The parasite is bizarre because it occurs everywhere in the world. It's from the hottest tropical areas to the polar areas. And it seems to be able to adapt to whatever the environmental conditions are and whatever the food web happens to be. It seems to be able to insert itself into that. And of course, a common idea among people is that parasites that get into hosts over long periods of time will kind of adjust to be more benign, to be less dangerous to the host. It doesn't make sense to try to kill the very habitat that you're living in, sort of a thing. But for trichinosis, it's just the opposite. The more damage you can do to a host, the better chances you have of it dying, the better chances that it's going to be scavenged by something else and
Okay.
survive them. So it's just the opposite strategy. Let's make my host as sick as I possibly can. Let's torture it until it dies, basically. And then it's going to be scavenged by something else, and I can just do the exact same thing in that animal too. So,
Jeez. Oh man. Heebie-Jeebies.
yeah.
Liver flukes. I mean, white-tailed deer is probably the most hunted and consumed venison on the continent. Animals, probably in numbers of game animals and probably in total, metric tons. I would hazard a guess. And they have liver flukes, or they can. And what is the system there that's at play?
Yeah, so these are huge, unlike the little tapeworms that are in the wolves, which are like the size of long grain rice. These things are huge. They're bigger than a loony, essentially. They're easy to see. And I think I start that chapter in the book by talking about a story about a biologist who went into a hunting camp in northern Michigan, and the hunters had a successful hunt and had killed a whitetail buck and were busy cooking the best parts of the whitetail, which were the sweetmeats. And the biologist wondered what the heck the sweetmeats were, and they brought him a plate of the sweetmeats over, and they were liver flukes. They were these giant liver flukes that were in the deer that they'd kill. So yeah, that's these liver flukes are interesting animals because
I
they're,
can't remember, like, where they did it, or just, there's these things in the deer. They're really good if you fry them
yeah,
up with bacon.
yeah, fry them up. Yeah. So they sauteed them, and yeah.
Jeez.
So,
Wow.
anyway, the worms, these worms basically produce eggs inside deer, and then they're passed to and moose and other herbivores, basically, and they're passed out, and then they need an aquatic ecosystem, so they end up having to get into snails, and then they reproduce themselves inside snails, so they increase their numbers inside snails. And then eventually the little larval stages will swim to aquatic vegetation, like reeds and bulrushes. And then they form like a cyst, it's almost like jelly on the outside, but it stops them from drying out. And they can just sort of sit there and they wait for an animal like a moose or a deer to come along and eat the vegetation. And once they eat the vegetation, then the life cycle gets completed, and the adult flukes end up living in the livers of the animals. They pair up. It's interesting. These animals they have both male and female reproductive systems in them, so they could potentially self-fertilize and produce. One animal could produce eggs. But what they seem to do is they seem to prefer to pair up with another fluke. They're called flukes, giant flukes. They pair up with another fluke, and they'll form a capsule in the liver tissue, and they live inside the capsule in the liver tissue. And then the eggs pass through the bile system into the intestine and eventually out that way. So yeah, they're
So does it affect the function of the liver? Like, is it harmful
yeah,
to the deer?
but the liver is a very plastic organ. It can easily regenerate, and it can handle the situation. And so deer don't usually get sick from the infection at all. They seem to survive quite well with it. But a good friend of mine has done a study on the antlers of deer, and in Pennsylvania and the southern United States. And they've got good evidence that the deer that are infected with liver flukes have more deformed antlers or smaller antlers than animals that don't. So there's some suggestion that says that, female deer, those are looking at the males and checking them out and can tell from the antlers if they're infected with parasites or not. And whether that makes a difference to their selecting a mate or not, that I don't know.
Wow.
But they do have effects like that. But in other ruminants, the parasites can have a much more significant effect. So there's really good evidence here from Alberta that in moose, they are killers. They can cause the moose to die.
The
And
liver flukes.
yeah, the liver flukes.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, we never used to see them. I'd done lots of necropsies, examinations of moose in the province and all kinds of areas of the province, and had never seen them in moose. And then they started to find dead moose in the Bow River Valley in southern Alberta. And just recently, they've started to see moose dying in Elk Island National Park, which is just to the east of Edmonton, and they have liver flukes. So suddenly, these liver flukes seem to be spreading. No, we think they're spreading their range and getting into moose and causing damage in moose. So,
Wow. Huh. So what is there any other animal involved
no,
in the liver fluke's life cycle? It's just
snails.
it's the snail to water to
Yeah. So
ungulate.
from the deer to snails. So the deer have to be defecating somewhere near water, fresh water,
Okay.
and then into snails, and then from snails to the vegetation, and then from the vegetation back to the
Yeah.
deer. Yeah.
Jeez.
But the good
All
news
right.
for hunters again is you can eat these things without getting infected or sick or anything.
Yeah. You can eat these things. Okay.
You're
Jeez.
not at risk.
Okay. Well, there you go. It's a delicacy in some countries,
There's a
or in some states. Was it
there's a
Wisconsin,
domesticated
Michigan?
there's a form of the parasite that's in domesticated animals too, like sheep. And there was a case in France where they were using irrigation water on watercress. So they had a farm that was growing watercress and they were using irrigation water from a pond where they had sheep that were using the pond, and they were using that water to irrigate their crop, watercress. So what they were doing was literally spreading the parasite from the aquatic ecosystem onto the plants, onto the watercress. And then they were washing the watercress off. But of course, remember what I said? They have those little jelly-like capsules that sort of stick them onto the vegetation. So they were washing those things off and then bagging them and then selling them to people who would use them in their salads. And so they started to see a bunch of human cases of liver flukes appearing in these people in France. And they found out they were all using lettuce or watercress from the same farm. So,
Oh, jeez.
but at
Holy.
least the giant ones that we find here in moose and deer are not infective to humans.
Okay. Well,
Although I don't know many people, do you, that would eat reeds or bulrushes from around lakes?
I don't know, like it's the whole, foraging part of people's, use of the outdoors in
Yeah.
collecting wild plants and cattails and those sorts of things, like the starchy bottoms, off of those are used in different ways of cooking and pickling and stuff. So there you go.
Who knows? Maybe something to watch for.
Yeah, we'll see if the foragers are tipping over, and then we'll go from there. We'll see what they've been cooking. So, Kevin Kossoan, you're gonna have to listen to this and and adjust your wetland foraging walks. So, brainworms. So this is another kind of deer moose kind of relationship one, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. These are, again, roundworms, kind of like trichinella that we talked about. And they live in the meningeal linings of deer. And brainworm, specifically lives in white-tailed deer. But the beauty of it is that they have basically no effects on white-tailed deer. You can find in local populations, you can find lots of the deer infected with the worms, but there's usually only 3, 4, 5, 8 worms in the brains of these white-tailed deer. And as far as we can tell, they're not having any significant effects on the white-tailed deer at all. It's a perfect sort of host parasite situation where the parasites have found a good place to live, although it's hard to get eggs out of the meninges of the brain to get outside. And yet, it's a good place to live, safe place to live, lots of nourishment and so on. And the deer are not affected, so that doesn't make a big effect on them. It looks like there's something we call concomitant immunity, so that once an animal gets infected with a parasite, it develops an immune response that stops other members of the same type of parasite from infecting.
Oh,
So it kind of
wow.
limits the number of worms that you're going to get infected with, which is a cool thing because the white-tailed deer don't get infected with many of these worms. But now that's the situation with white-tailed deer. The situation with just about every other kind of ungulate and even domesticated animals, they've done experimental infections in guinea pigs and things like that, is that when they get infected with these same parasites, it causes a horrible neurological disease. And it, of course, affects the brains. The animals become ataxic. They have trouble walking. They stagger around. They'll hold their heads at a funny angle. They become paralyzed. And then they'll collapse, essentially just collapse and die. So it's a real killer in other animals. Caribou are terribly susceptible to it. Moose, goats, bighorn sheep, just about any other kind of animal, but not white-tailed deer. And so they seem to kill other ungulates. And there's
Yeah.
one really interesting suggestion that says, over recent historical times, the population of whitetails in North America have really expanded. And they're just, spreading out and much more dense than they used to be. Heck, I live in suburban Edmonton, and we've had 4 or 5 white-tailed deer in our backyard here in the yard. So why are they suddenly becoming so successful? And of course, we've removed the major predators, so we've taken those out of the situation, which has helped them. But the other thing is, in an undisturbed habitat, they will compete with moose for forage, and moose win. Moose can outcompete deer. But bring brainworms into the situation, and what suddenly happens is deer are fighting moose with a biological weapon. They're
Jeez.
using their own parasites to control moose populations, or sadly, caribou populations and other ungulates. And the result is they're wiping out their competitors with these brainworms. So they're
So
using
how
them
does
as
it
weapons.
get out of the whitetail? Like, so when you said
Yeah.
it's in the fluid around their brains and their
Right, and
spinal
then
cord, right?
meningeal fluids and
Okay. So how
so
does
they
it get out of that into
the
the
larval
environment?
stages are able to make their way into the blood vessels, into the
Okay.
circulatory system.
Okay.
And then from there, they get into the lungs, the lung tissues, and then they work their way up the trachea into the throat area, and are coughed and pass through the digestive system of the deer, and then are released with the feces onto the ground.
Okay.
And then they
So,
get consumed by terrestrial snails.
jeez.
So the little slugs and snails that we have in our gardens are the things that they will ingest. They will ingest the larval stages, and then the larvae complete their development to the infective stage inside those little snails and slugs. And of course, a deer would get infected by grazing and happening to eat some of these infected snails and slugs, and that's how they get infected with these things.
Wow. Biological weapon. I like that
Yeah,
word. I
yeah,
like it. Like it, not like it, but it's a good way to describe like what's actually going on in this perfectly balanced ecosystem where everything's in harmony in
yeah.
nature. And if people would just leave it alone, it's like, holy smokes, It's a deer kill moose world out there.
Well, the good news, the
Wow.
good news for us in the West here is that there's no brainworm here. It's almost like there's an invisible barrier in North America that stops them at the Manitoba border and stops them from heading west. So
Really?
our bighorn sheep and our mountain goats and our caribou and our elk and our moose have not been infected by these. And the question is,
Hmm.
what's stopping it? What's going on? And nobody knows for sure, but there's some suggestions that it could be environmental factors. So it could be the number of frost-free days we have. Because remember, the little larvae are passed out on the ground with the feces of the deer, so they have to maybe survive periods of freezing and bad weather to make it into the little snails. So there's that possibility. But there's an even cooler possibility and more likely. We have different types of these worms, different species of these worms living here than they have in the East. And actually, two different species. And there's some good suggestions to tell us that the animals that get infected with these relatives of brainworms develop immunity to brainworms. So they can't get infected with brainworms. So the worms
Interesting.
have sort of divided up North America into the eastern and southern parts of the map where brainworms occur, and then in the western parts of the map where we have two other species of these worms that luckily don't live in the brains. They live in the muscles, muscle tissues, and elsewhere. And so the worms have sort of separated themselves out this way on North America. Now, whether
Jeez.
that, we don't know that's the case for sure. And how could something like global climate change affect that? What could changing the number of frost-free days we have in a year suddenly cause the problem to become present here in North America, in Western North
Yeah,
America?
because I mean, gosh, just about every other species of wildlife and plant in the North American continent has all expanded and developed its range following the recession of glaciers, which is essentially because the climate of, the continent changed as the glaciers receded and the hypsothermals changed and whatnot. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things in nature that are just waiting to capitalize on climatic shifts and hopefully we don't see it in our lifetime in the
Well,
West. So
I think we are already seeing it with ticks. We're seeing a
okay,
massive increase in the expansion of ranges of ticks and the numbers of ticks
ticks. Yeah,
and where they're located. And
yeah,
so I think
yeah.
that's
That's an indicator.
an
Yep,
indicator right now that's happening. So yeah.
yep, yep. Interesting. Oh, so you mentioned this earlier in the podcast. Coyotes, particularly the ones that are now living in urban environments, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, Vancouver, Stanley Park, and everybody is moving towards coexisting with the coyotes. We need to live with them and let them keep our pets and our dog food inside and give them space and stuff. But these guys are living a lot different life than the ones in the wild, from what I understand, as far as ailments and parasites and stuff. So and a lot of seminal work on this has been done in and around Edmonton,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken. So what's the deal with? I think you mentioned the hydatid disease as well earlier, and that's a tapeworm.
Yeah. So my good friend Colleen Cassidy St. Clair at the U of A has done a lot of research on coyotes, urban coyotes here. It's amazing the numbers of urban coyotes that we have. I had no idea we had so many urban coyotes, although almost every time I take my dog for a walk, we're likely to see one. They're a massive they're a natural part of our urban landscape now.
Yep.
And
Yep.
sadly, lots of studies have indicated that they're not as healthy as wild coyotes, sylvatic coyotes. They've got lots of health issues associated with them. You see higher frequency of cases of mange, for example, sarcoptic mange, which are little horrible mites that burrow under the skin. And lice, lice that normally are very, very rare. We see lots of infestations of lice on these animals. And if you, we did a study where we necropsied looked at a bunch of roadkill coyotes in the Edmonton area, and they were shockingly 70% or more infected with these little tapeworms that I talked about previously, a kind of caucus. And the bad news is the especially dangerous one, the one that causes a spread like cancer through the organs. So 70% of the coyotes have that. And they have large,
in the
huge
city.
tapeworms as well. And they have lots of different kinds of flukes, and they have a huge variety of different internal parasites and external parasites. And not only that, it looks like they're suffering from cases of toxicity from mycotoxins, which they're getting from eating spoiled, rotten food and coexisting around landfills and dumps and places like that. So
Compost piles.
they're
I
not
think
healthy.
I read that. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're not healthy. And there's some research, I don't know how much has been done so far, that indicates that the ones that are mostly infected with parasites are the ones that cause problems by attacking people or attacking domesticated animals too.
Oh,
So
interesting.
the sicker they are, the more likely they are to become bolder at coming into our backyards and trying to snatch your cat or your dog and
Yeah,
causing
yeah.
problems like that. So
Wow.
yeah,
Now, that one of the parasites, is it a tapeworm that can, same thing, eggs in the feces, your dog sniffs it, you go home, you get it from your dog, and then it can infect humans, and there's a lot of cases from what I understand in the Edmonton area, like relative to North America,
yeah,
and it has been misdiagnosed.
yeah. My guess is it's because the medical people in the Edmonton area are now looking for it,
Okay,
thinking of it
okay.
as a possibility versus doctors in, say, Boston or New York misdiagnosing it as just another cancer sort of case. So probably the more people are aware of it, and especially the medical community are aware of it, because the symptoms are very, very similar to cancer in humans. So as a result of that, the more people are aware of it, the more likely it is to be diagnosed. Yeah, I don't think there's anything particularly special about Edmonton versus, say, Calgary or maybe even Vancouver. Um, but
Just
nevertheless, it's just
people have tuned into it there
people have tuned into
in
it
there.
more.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, that's a lot of that stuff seems to work, in medical fields. Somebody discovers it, they document it, the cases go out, then other medical professionals start, you know, reading the research, picking up red flags, and then next thing you know, everybody's finding it everywhere. So this is not a good thing. It's pretty damn scary, actually.
yeah, it is.
And I do have serious concerns over human health and just the welfare of coyotes themselves for folks that are promoting this, you know, system of coexisting in the urban environment. And it's just like, it's not good for anybody. Animals are sick, people, lives are at stake and stuff. And I'm just, at some point, when it comes to big urban cities, I think we have to draw a line and say this is human habitat and this is not good for something like a coyote to be living here, and manage it a little bit more aggressively so that we're not perpetuating generations of coyotes that have to live these diseased lives and maybe die of, like you said, like a toxic mold that they inhale out of a rotten pile of grass clippings in an alleyway or something like that. Like that's nobody wants to see that either. But or nobody wants to see somebody die from picking up a parasite from one of these guys. So yeah, some soul searching there for some urban centers, like Toronto and Vancouver and stuff.
I have heard of one interesting idea, and I don't know if it's been tried anywhere yet, of putting out medicated baits specifically
Mm,
for coyotes. So you would be treating them with medicine to get rid of their infections particularly of trichinosis, little tapeworm.
They do something like that with rabies in raccoons in Ontario.
Yeah.
They actually like drop it out of airplanes. I don't want to be too politically incorrect here, but if you have cities that have a lot of like unhomeless, like homeless people or whatever, like you got a narcotic that's in like it's like leave it there for the coyotes, folks. Like it's like so sorry, that was in bad taste. But I mean, we could have people would maybe be parasite free or healthy. Well, okay, we'll leave it there. The next one I want to cover, I was saying before the show, I just literally saw this in my news feed this morning. I'll just read this little thing from the BBC. Has been an exponential increase in marine mammal strandings in waters around Scotland. The numbers of whales, dolphins, and porpoises getting into difficulty has risen from about 100 a year to more than 300 over a 30-year period. Researchers at the University of Glasgow said possible causes include chemical, plastic, noise pollution, and accidental entanglements in fishing gear. More than 5,100 stranded marine animals were recorded between 1992 and 2022 off the coast of Scotland. You talk about this in your chapter, and it was definitely one of the most shocking things for me. But what have scientists discovered with these strandings and the relationship with parasites?
Yeah, well, so with these animals, we seem to get solitary strandings, accidents where individual animals get stranded and die or found on beaches, and mass stranding events where you get hundreds of marine mammals that will beach themselves or be caught on beaches, and wonderful people, volunteers, try to rescue these animals and will do everything they can to save them, and even towing them back out into the ocean, and then just sadly to see them just turn right back and strand themselves again
Yeah,
and die. It seems like strange behavior. Why? What's going on? And there's, the saying that we know less about our oceans than we do about any other ecosystem on the planet is really true. And studying parasites is not easy, and studying marine parasites is a degree of difficulty harder. You can imagine trying to do experiments with animals or even just observational studies of animals in the oceans. It's extremely hard and challenging. So, the old rule in science is that a correlation does not mean causality. So just because you find things correlated doesn't mean that that's the cause of the problem. And interestingly enough, when people started investigating, doing necropsies and investigations of the animals that are stranding themselves, they find that a significant proportion of them are infected with parasites, and especially a parasitic flatworm. So this is kind of related to those liver flukes that lives in the brains and the melons, sort of chambers that are used for echolocation of pilot whales and other types of whales. And so there's a correlation between stranded animals and the number of the animals that are infected. So stranded animals seem to have a greater proportion of and a higher number of these parasites than animals that are just living in the open ocean. Does that mean these parasites are causing the problem? So when you do a necropsy of these animals, you do see pathology. You can see where the parasites are causing damage to the internal organs of the whales. For instance, pilot whales. You see inflammation, and you see blood, you see hemorrhaging. So you see problems that are the result of these parasites. But does that mean that they've caused the animals to be stranded? And why would it cause mass stranding events to occur? Because when you have these mass stranding events, not every animal you find stranded on the beach is going to be infected with these parasites. So for species like pilot whales are called that because they usually have a few leaders that lead the group of whales through the ocean, lead them to hunting areas, lead them away from danger, from predators like orca whales and things like that. And so the suggestion was made, Well, what would happen if one of the leaders was so badly infected with these parasites that it became disoriented, or it was unable to communicate properly, or it couldn't do echolocation properly, and it ended up getting stranded? And if it got stranded, then it started making sort of distress calls to the rest of the group of whales, and so they would try to come to its rescue or follow it. And you'd end up with a mass stranding event. And the reason for this mass stranding event would be the parasites that the animals had, the leaders of these whales had. But you can imagine there's all kinds of complication factors as well.
Yeah.
So what if plastic pollution has done something to the immune systems of these whales, and it makes them more susceptible to parasites? So the parasites aren't causing the mass stranding; they're just happenstance from the poor health of the animal itself. So there's all kinds of complications that are going on. Again, marine research is poorly underfunded, and we know so little about life in the oceans, what's happening in our oceans. So it's a real sort of an interesting mystery that's going to happen. Let's see.
Yeah. So, but it is something relatively recent that scientists are starting to learn and see the correlation. So more questions are being asked, and more specific, looking for something in these mass strandings and the relationships between some of these factors. But there's definitely something relatable there. Parasites are present in these stranded animals.
Yeah.
Wow.
I guess time will tell us if they are really a cause or just sort of traveling along for the ride, sort of.
Yeah, they're there, but they're not the causal factor. No, it's interesting. The next one, talk about, we'll leave the North American continent, head over to Africa. There's questions have been going on in zoology for ages about the stripes on zebras. And kind of one of the prevailing theories that has sort of jumped out at there is this confusion factor of multiple zebras in groups running, dodging, turning, these kind of like, what are those kaleidoscope things that you look at with everything looks all Ouija, and the lions have trouble like selecting a single animal to target it. So it's like it's a woo kind of thing, to confuse the predators. I even before I read your book, I'm like, no, if that was what's going on, like the lions would have figured that out. They would have evolved something selected for a different type of eyesight, and they're like the tigers, tigers, the animals are green. The orange is green to the prey animals. That's how it works with tigers. Like evolution would have figured that out.
Yeah.
Because lions are successful and they manage to kill these things. So your book talks about a different conclusion that scientists have come to that are parasite related.
Yeah. And this one, the evidence is really strong. So it's kind of fun for me as a parasitologist. So yeah, ever since the days of Charles Darwin and Russell Wallace, people have argued about what the function of stripes on zebras are, and do they provide camouflage? Are they hiding the animals from predators? Are they causing a dazzle effect, like you said, and a startle effect? And the predators can't decide on one animal to attack, and so they don't catch any of them. Or is it thermal regulation? Maybe they're using the black and white stripes to thermal regulate so they can control their
I hadn't
body
heard that one.
temperatures that way, sort of thing. So lots of research has been done, and so we're on pretty firm ground here. And it turns out that it doesn't seem to have anything to do with predators. So lots of studies have indicated that predators don't have any trouble seeing zebras at all. And in fact, they still are catching lots of zebras and killing them and doing quite well. So it doesn't seem to have much to do with predator biology. So thermoregulation's a good one, though. So in areas
claws and fang predators.
Yeah, claws and fang predators. Yeah. So what about thermal regulation? Do you see a correlation between how many stripes or the kinds of stripes you see in zebras and where they're living. So the ones that are living closest to the equator, where it's the hottest, do they have a number of black stripes or white stripes or patterns of the stripes and so on? And yeah, there's some evidence to indicate that that's the case. But when they did studies using devices that could measure the body temperatures of the animals from a distance, their surface body temperatures, they noticed that it wasn't really having a very drastic effect whatsoever. So it didn't really seem to be strongly correlated with the striping pattern, didn't seem to have much to do with thermal regulation either. So we've lost predators as an explanation. We've lost thermal regulation as a possible explanation. So what are we left? And of course, if you've ever been to a pasture with horses, you know that there are lots of flies that like to bite horses. Zebras are no exception. And in Africa, there are really a lot of flies that like to bite zebras. There's tsetse flies. And tsetse flies are really dangerous because they spread protozoan infections that cause things like African sleeping sickness. And in wildlife, they cause a disease called nagana, which is very similar to African sleeping sickness, and it can kill. So there's tsetse flies, but there's also other biting flies as well. And of course, there's bot flies, and there's tabanids, which are deer and horse flies. So people started to do studies on the effects of striping, and some of the funniest experiments you can imagine. So imagine a researcher and his volunteer grad students wearing different kinds of shirts, walking around, some with black shirts, some with white shirts, some with horizontal stripes, some with vertical stripes, and seeing who gets bitten the most.
The most. I would assume.
Lo and behold, what they discovered is the people that were wearing the vertically striped shirts got bitten about half as often as the ones who were wearing other colors. Poor people wearing the black shirts were really getting hammered, but the other ones were not. So then they tried other experiments, and they took horses in pastures, and they painted them. So they painted them black, they painted them white, they painted them with horizontal stripes and with zebra stripes, and then they collected the number of flies that were attracted to these horses. And once again, the evidence was really strong. The ones that had vertical stripes were getting far fewer biting flies landing on them and taking blood meals than the ones who were colored otherwise. And lo and behold, it turns out that one of the complications is that it's kind of correlated with thermal regulation, because the places where there are the most biting flies are the places where there's more warmth and also humid conditions for the flies to reproduce. So those two factors are kind of tied together. Thermal regulation and biting flies are tied together. But without a doubt, I think we can come to the conclusion that the reason that zebras have stripes is to reduce the number of horse flies that they get bitten by. And if you needed any proof of this, researchers in Japan came through for us. They took cattle, and they painted them with black and white stripes, horizontal, vertical, and then they just left some plain, and they painted some black and some white. And without a doubt, the ones that were painted with zebra stripes got bitten far fewer times by biting flies. So it looks for certain that the reason the zebras have stripes is to reduce the number of biting flies that they're pestered with. And you know, the biting flies are not only an irritant, they're not just taking blood meals and they're painful. Have you guys been bitten by deer flies or horse flies? I've never been bitten by one. So strangely enough, I'm not attracted to them at all. But I've heard that the bites are very painful, that you feel them when they're biting, sort of thing.
Yeah, so they take like a little chunk out of you. The mosquito just runs the needle in and out, where they're like a little tiny shark or a piranha, like it's it's nasty.
So besides the irritation, they consume a heck of a lot of blood. They cause every one of them that bites, tabanids, the horseflies that bites, takes quite a large blood meal, so they can cause anemia and other problems. But they also spread infections, other infections like viruses and bacteria and protozoans as well. So it's not surprising. In fact, going back to the original argument about whether predators were the reason for the stripes on zebras, they kind of are, but not the giant predators people were thinking about, hyenas and lions,
The
but
little
the
ones with
small
wings.
micro predators like biting flies are the reason.
Yeah.
If that's the reason zebras are striped, is it why, you start getting all kinds of questions. Why aren't giraffes striped? Why do they
Yeah.
have spots? Why isn't every animal in African savanna striped? Right? Why isn't this common? Those are really cool questions that we don't have an answer to yet. So
Yeah. I mean, the thing I found fascinating about this story is this is a stark example of the parasites driving evolution.
oh yeah.
And like it's seems, very clear to me. So I don't know a lot about evolutionary history of all, the species in Africa, but maybe not everybody's on the same trajectory, like the zebras got it figured out first. Maybe it's a giraffe thing as well. The kind of the octagon things that are on them, and maybe the others are like still on their trajectory of trying to find the fittest or the best adaptations for that environment.
Yeah.
Hopefully before otherwise their species might go extinct from maybe too many biting flies. But yeah, it's a cool story, and it kind of comes full circle. What I talked about at the beginning about kind of like these little tiny things, invisible things that are driving like significant ecosystem dynamics and evolution in the case of the zebra. Now the last one, just kind of to bring it all home, is this idea of influences on ecosystems. And I just want to read a little chunk out of your book here. So the sub chapter is, could parasites control whole ecosystems too? Through the years, many ecologists have studied predation and how it can structure food webs and entire biological communities. Due to the discovery of parasites using altered host behavior, we now realize that hidden behind a curtain in the background, parasites are using methods like mind control that may affect larger scale biological processes. In nature, parasites may be affecting which animals get eaten, how many are eaten, and even when it happens. Parasites may be hidden puppet masters working behind the scenes to control trophic interactions and to structure whole biological communities. Therefore, in a way, parasites are now exerting mind control on biologists, forcing them to change the way they think about predation, energy flow, biological diversity, and even entire ecosystems. What are your summing thoughts there of that? I mean, it kind of comes a little full circle to the idea I wanted people to think about, that, the narratives that come from the mammal scientists, about the pinnacles of our ecosystems being grizzly bears, being wolves, being these big charismatic animals. And this seems to paint a very different story from a different type of science.
Yeah. I think, I guess the point I was trying to make there was that as much as we think we know about what's happening in an ecosystem and how we think that we've got it figured out, how energy flows through that ecosystem and who the uh, keystone species is in the ecosystem that's kind of controlling the diversity and abundance and distribution of all the other organisms that are in that ecosystem. We have to always kind of be aware. And sadly, a lot of biologists themselves are not aware of this, that there's other things that are going on behind the scenes that can be having major effects on what we're seeing and can, in fact, be responsible for some of the patterns that we're looking for or we're finding in ecosystems themselves. And you cannot, when I started my career as a parasitologist, a lot of people would argue, oh, parasites can't be important. They're too small. They are too rare. They are not abundant enough. They definitely can't be having that great an effect on on individual organisms or whole ecosystems. But I think that as time has gone on, the more and more and more about parasites and the effects that they can have on animals, the more and more and more we have to be thinking that there could be something else going on there besides what we're thinking, how we're picturing that ecosystem to be structured. And maybe we should take a more detailed look at what's happening to the organisms that we can't see, the ones that we can't track, the ones we can't put radio collars on and follow. And those are important too. I don't want
No,
to take
very.
anything away from mammalogists, of course, because we need them to be doing their studies and figuring things out as well. But it would be nice if they're aware that there are other things that are going on in the ecosystem as well.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. And, I see a similar thing coming like from the plant ecology kind of side, in my background is it's sort of the same thing. There's a focus on these big ticket items like forests and biomes and the big coastal rainforest and the Amazon jungle and like, all this kind of stuff, medicinal plants that are useful to people and looking at, the ecosystems from there where more scientists are starting to kind of crop up and talk about this, but the fundamental basis of the productivity of the plant communities on the planet are driven by soil fungi. And in North America, because our soils are not very well developed, most of the productivity of the plants can't be explained by nutrient recycling, and it's explained by soil mycorrhizae that are extracting nutrients out of the air that are chemically mobilizing it and literally injecting it into the plants, which explains why a forest can get so big, so fast. And so I come back to this thing, like, I mean, that's you look at the food web, right? And all these ungulates and herbivores and things that people like have to survive off the sun's energy, which comes from the primary producers. What's controlling the primary producers? Soil fungi. In the ocean, I'm not that familiar, but I see a same relationship with phytoplankton. That's where it all starts, to the biggest, blue whale. And now seeing the world through your lens, through parasites, I'm seeing a lot more of these things in the terrestrial wildlife ecosystem type components. And it does concern me in where science is headed, because I just see a tremendous amount of young people being caught up in the sensationalism of going, there's another grad student that's studying wolves, another one that's going to study wolves, another one that's becoming a grizzly bear biologist. It's important. Yes, it is. But there's all these other things that get neglected, and you've probably seen this in your career. I know I've seen it, where they take all of the major phylums and the amount of scientific publications there published in each one of them, and animal kingdom and mammalia, it's like it dominates because that's what we're in, and those are the animals we're most interested in. The least amount of research is happening on microbes, on fungi, on mollusks, and all these other organisms. But something as simple as what we've talked about the last hour, they could be one of the most important things in understanding ecosystems and how we might think differently and how we manage, quote unquote, manage things like wildlife and sustainable use. And I love it. It's just, this book was like disruptive technology almost, like it. And I hope this episode was too, right? Just really got people thinking things differently. The whole wolf tapeworm, relationship is just kind of sheds light on even topics that people are interested in predator management right now. Like, maybe the wrong thing is being managed, right? Maybe you don't need to manage the furs and the fangs. We need to manage the parasite loads that these furs and fangs are carrying. And, we might have a more balanced or sustainable moose population for what humans want out of moose as well. So I don't know. There's just all these things, like I said, as an ecologist, that your book has kind of lit up in me, and I thank you for that. I thank you for taking the time to write both the books, the Flying Circus, the ones on birds was truly fascinating as well. And just the whole idea of these things just being these ecosystems that flap past you or whatever, like good, bad, the ugly of what these birds are dealing with. It's just Curtis raises chickens. He knows all about parasites and birds and stuff and mites and and all this kind of stuff. There's it's not a flying circus. You just got like a ground scratching circus or whatever you want to call it in the back 40 here. So Mike, this is a great conversation. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you taking the time. I just think this is, people always tell us they like listening to our podcast because they learn something, about wildlife, about nature. They don't have to be hunters. We're just increasing our understanding of how ecosystems work so that we can better exist, manage, and take what everybody wants or needs from the ecosystems. And I think we need to be looking more closely at parasites because
Good.
I think they're a pretty strong thing out there. So if you're a grad student and you're listening to this and you wanted to do another grad thesis on wolves, maybe drop it and do it on trichinella and walrus in the Canadian Arctic, because
Exactly.
we need to know a few more things. There's some gaps there. So appreciate it. Curtis, take it away.
John.
Thank you.
The Hunter Conservationist Podcast is brought to you by J. Martin Taxidermy. 10 out of 10 taxidermists recommend that the best prevention for getting parasites is to have your animals taxidermized. That's I'm looking at.
Tanned and mounted.
yeah. Tanned and mounted. I think that the transmission rate is probably next to none. So if you have the Heebie-Jeebies after listening to this show, a good way to ensure that you're not gonna get parasites is maybe get your big bull elk that you get this year mounted up by Jesse. Probably won't have parasites. That being said, a buddy of mine, his dad did a hunt in Africa, and he came back with a big kudu, and tanned inside the skin, still in there, are ticks.
Wow.
All the way up the chest. It's got all the ticks. You can still see them. But I don't think those ones are biting anybody. So as always, Big shout out, big thanks to Jesse for supporting us here at the show. So thank you to J. Martin Taxidermy.
And thank you, Mike. It's kind of interesting, but I read your book this winter and this whole conversation that we just had. And then I read another monster of a book, took me all winter long to finish it. It's called Bones, and it's by Elaine Dewar. And it's basically looking at all of the scientific evidence about the peopling of North America and sort of the science that dispels the notion of the mass migration of humans across the Bering Land Bridge, and the ice-free corridor through North America may not have existed. Anyways, one of the interesting parts of that book involved human parasites, and scientists coming to the conclusion that there's been waves of people from different regions of the world land in North America, evolve, dominate for a period of time, and then diminish. And what scientists have found to lead to those theories is in the archaeological sites, when they find the coprolites from people in settlements, which are the fossilized poops, they're finding parasites. And they're finding, I think it's the roundworms. And there's roundworms that are species specific to humans from certain climatic regions of the world. So they know when they find coprolites in such and such a part of North America that these came from South America. They did not come from Beringia. So there's all this evidence using parasites in people to change the theory of how we think about the peopling of North America being these waves of events, waves of people from different parts of the world, not this thing that we've all been taught about the Bering Land Bridge. So I just kind of thought I was on a parasite roll this winter, reading your book and then Elaine's book. But I kind of thought I just wanted to throw that in there because it kind of like transitions into our understanding of our own species as well, and answering that age-old question that humans like to ask. How did we get here? Where did we come from? It's important to us. And it seems that the people studying parasites in archaeology may be shedding light on the peopling of North America and maybe the world. So interesting field. Thanks, Mike, and appreciate the conversation. And hey, folks, we'll catch you in the next episode.